Hi, and welcome to week 3 of Black Girl Magic Book Chat Women's History Month edition. If this is your first video all month long, I, Larissa McNeil, the AARC coordinator, is reading and highlighting stories about Black and African American women and girls in honor of Women's History Month. Our last two books took us to Nigeria and New York City. This time around, we are in Kentucky in Crystal Wilkinson's The Birds of Opulence. What a beautiful cover. I really like this bird. This is the Sankofa bird that we use on the AARC logos. And I just think it's incredible. You should look up the Sankofa bird and kind of that history and that what it means. It's lovely. And I just think this is a great cover. So this book, it was a book that highlighted the lives of several women and girls over a few generations in this town called Opulence, deep in Appalachia. Appalachia. How do y'all say it? Appalachia? Um, we don't hear many stories about Black people in Appalachia. I think that's how I'm going to say it. And I was excited to dive into it. Just like I said, we don't see many stories about Black people living in Appalachia. It's got their own stereotypes, some negative, some not, but it was very interesting to see, to read this book. And so I was excited to dive in. I'm going to be honest, y'all. I don't know what to say about it. I say, and then I'm going to speak for 10 more minutes. But in the best way, I honestly am still sitting with it. I finished it last night, literally. And so it's one that I'm still sort of parsing through, I think, in my head. It's one of those books where, like, not a lot happens, but so much is said. So it's not plot heavy. Like, it's not just, but there's just so much being said in this book. Okay, the book starts off with the birth of Lucy's daughter, Yolanda, and she has this baby in a squash field. Sorry. She has this baby, like literally, they're in the garden, they're picking fruit and veggies, because they have a garden, and she goes into labor and she has this baby. And after this birth, we see Yolanda struggle to connect with her daughter and quite honestly struggle to connect with anything else ever again. Lucy's family also includes her husband, Joe Brown. He's a mechanic, and he's described as someone kind and gentle. He's from the North, which, they don't love, but he proves himself. She has an older son, Kevin. They call him Kiki. But the men aren't important in this book. The birds of opulence are the women, and they are who take center stage in this book. So more important, kind of, are Tookie, who is Lucy's mother, and Minnie Mae, Lucy's grandmother. And they all live in this house together, and they all kind of struggle in their own minds in different ways. Across the way lives Francine, and she's an outsider whose husband was from Opulence. He, was away for a while. He comes back with this wife. The people don't love it. She keeps to herself. He died some years ago. One night she has a baby. And it's not clear to me whether or not she knew she was pregnant. But then she has this baby, and her name is Mona, and she grows up to be friends with Yolanda. And so these are the women and girls who we follow throughout this book. I did have to write it down at the beginning to kind of keep up with who is who, but you get there. It's hard to describe this book without telling everything because, like I said, it's kind of light on plot, but the feelings it evokes. It is ostensibly a story about mental illness. We see the effects of postpartum and isolation and how these women really settle in their own heads to get away or maybe they like it there more. That's the thing about mental illness, right? We see these women settle into their heads for whatever reason their bodies and their minds are telling them that they need to. But this book is also about women and the pressures that the world puts onto them, and the pressures that they uphold so strongly. We see the way that gossip spreads so easily when you don't behave the way that you're supposed to, and any woman watching this knows how our behavior is often policed. We see how older women's silence can be detrimental to their younger counterparts, as if silence can keep from harming people, when really that silence just means that young girls don't know what to do with that harm when it comes to them. And then they're blamed for that harm. And this we definitely see when one of the characters gets pregnant as a young girl and her mother finds out, and she beats her horribly. But the girl had no idea what sex was and what pregnancy was, not really, because it was never told to her. There seems to be in a lot of these spaces this assumption that with age just comes knowledge of these things, and so you should just know better. But what do I know? I don't know. I don't know. Right? And so we see how that silence and that assumption that people are just supposed to know what they're not supposed to do can actually cause them to do what they're not supposed to do. And then they get, like I said, then they get blamed for it. And all they're told really is that it's their bodies, right? That once they start to grow the womanly parts of their bodies, they become fast tail because their bodies are mature, even though they have no control over that, even though they don't know what that means, even though it's not their fault. And then when they're put into situations that they don't know how to get out of, that they don't know how they got into, and it results in pregnancy, she's shunned, and especially by her own mother, and that had to be hurtful, right? We also see how so-called outsiders do not get a chance to integrate, how untrustworthy they seem to locals, especially the women who come into the town, and how that causes isolation. One of the characters spends pretty much all of her time in her house, talking to nobody except her child. Even doing so much as going to the next town over to go to the grocery store so that she doesn't see the women in the town who do nothing but treat her poorly. Because, if y'all talking about me, I'm going to go to the store across the town too. After I read these books, I always do a sort of read through of other analyses and interviews with the author, if I can find them, other analyses that people have written, not to rewrite it, and that's not what I'm doing, but it helps me kind of put into context what the book's about, and kind of understand a little bit more, right? And I remember reading one after I finished this book, and I can't remember who wrote it now, but it said that this is a book that explores the world of the people in our communities that are always sort of invisible. It's the women in your lives who stay at home and cook, who really only go to church and to the market, who have little life outside of the families that they've either been forced into or have cultivated. And in these families, they're not always emotionally safe. The men view them as fussy and they don't trust them to make decisions. I remember when I was teaching, and there was a guy that I worked with, and he said to me and another woman coworker that women are biologically geared to hate each other. And I think that's false. I think we are socialized to hate each other in some ways. And this book kind of shows us that, where other women hold other women to impossible standards that they can't even meet. And when they inevitably fall or fail to rise above those expectations, the judgment and the persecution is harsh and it is swift. This book was kind of hard to read in some ways because I see people that I know in them. I see some family members, some people that I went to church with when I was going, some people that I grew up around. And then it was also a little, I was trying to figure out the best word for this, but a little whiplashy. because we see these women do these things to each other that are not kind. But then they turn around and are there for each other in times of grief and death. And that's how families are. Realistically, in some ways, and some communities are like that. Not all of them, obviously. We all have our own stories, but I've seen this. And so as I was reading this, and I'm still sitting with it and kind of thinking about the ways that it mirrored parts of worlds that I knew growing up, and in ways that it's different from parts of my world growing up. Um, it really was a story about kind of what is happening in the heads of women who I feel like never even leave their towns. These are the types of places where you don't go anywhere. Honestly, you rarely go across town. And what that sort of living in this sort of microcosm, this like isolated space where it's just you and your generations of people, and it's always been your generations of people, and the generations of people across the street, you've known them for decades, and right? And so it's an interesting look in how people have to, women especially, have to learn to navigate that, because it can be isolating and it can feel oppressive. And it can be beautiful too, right? We don't want to negate, and we don't want to make this seem like people who live this way are, horrible. But this book does make you think about some of the horribleness, and kind of how mental illness is a part of that, and a part that we don't talk about at all. Or if we do, it's negatively and not in a way that's helpful. Um, I could go off on tangents about that. I'm still, as I'm even talking to y'all, I'm like figuring out how I feel, because it was that kind of book. Because it was just so beautifully written. It was intense. It was descriptive. I was there in Opulence, y'all. I could see the houses. I could see the people. I could see the churches, the grocery stores. I could see what they were wearing, the meadows that the kids played in. If you read this book for nothing else, it is because Miss Wilkinson can write. Okay. Um, I wish that I could read it again and like do a follow up in a year to see like what other things that I've thought about, and maybe I will for myself. But I recommend it, and if you do read it, let me know what you think. My email's all over the place. Let me know, seriously. Next week, I am making my way over to Oakland with Night Crawling by Layla Motley. I can't wait to share it with y'all. And so until then, thank you for watching Black Girl Magic Book Chat Women's History Month edition. I hope to see you back next week.